In this sense, the style of the new Pope was more important than his specific policies. Apart from anything he decreed or authorized, John immediately effected a revolution in the public image of the papal office, an abrupt transition from the concept of the Pope as ruler to the people as kindly pastor. Whereas Pius XII was tall, thin, aloof, austere, and aristocratic, John was short, rotund, and informal, given to making jokes at his own expense, and he deliberately departed from papal protocol by the kinds of guests he received. He received the Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury, the 80th son-in-law of the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. John signaled that he would no longer be the prisoner of the Vatican. When he left Rome to visit the Marian Shrine of Loreto and other places in Italy, his first trip outside the Vatican was to a prison, an act meant to exemplify the ancient papal title of servant of the servant of God. Myth. Because of John's style, few popes have had so many myths woven about them. Thus, he was often called the peasant pope, although in fact, his family might be called lower middle class. Dubbed pastoral, he spent part of his career in administration and the rest as a Vatican diplomat, culminating in only 5 years as head of diocese. Far from simple, he was intellectually and politically sophisticated. John's spiritual diary, the Journal of a Soul, revealed a man of deep traditional piety, and his liberalism was qualified by such acts as mandating the teaching of Latin in all seminaries at a time when it was being phased out in many places, and mandating the inclusion of Saint Joseph in the canon of the Mass after the fathers of the Second Vatican Council had shown no interest in the matter. A council. John's pontificate was one of the most momentous in the history of the Church, mainly because of the council, which to the surprise of everyone is summoned less than a year after his election, at a time when most Catholics had probably never even heard of such a thing. An ecumenical council is a gathering of the entire Church and does not refer to the ecumenical movement to which Vatican II would give its support. Although Pius XII had considered the possibility, there had been no such gathering since the Vatican Council of 1870, now called Vatican I, which had never been officially dissolved. Some of John's advisors urged caution, but he brushed aside all misgiving. A new Pentecost. Precisely why the council was summoned remains somewhat uncertain. John announced its goal as the renewal of the spirit of the gospel in the heart of people everywhere and the adjustment of Christian discipline to a modern-day living. He spoke of a new Pentecost and stated serenely that since the teachings of the Church were firm and not in doubt, the council would not concern itself with doctrine, but would be primarily a pastoral council. A healthy church. For the most part, the church at the time seemed quite healthy. The rate of church attendance in many countries was remarkably high. It is said that the attendance was over 3/4 of Catholics. They attended the Sunday Mass in the United States. And also religious vocations were abundant, and Catholics seemed very serious about their faith, although they were sometimes criticized as neglectful of social justice and overly formalistic or mechanical in their piety. Clerical scandals were rare. The level of priestly education and zeal was high, and not since the patristic period had the laity been so well instructed in their faith. Since World War I, the importance of the Holy See in international affairs had been recognized in the number of countries with which the Vatican had official diplomatic relations, up from only 15 at the beginning of the century to 78 by the year 1968. Evangelization. It is likely that John thought that the new Pentecost would build on this foundation to bring Christ to the nations. He hoped for nothing less than the conversion of the world, something that required Catholics to put aside the defensiveness that had characterized the Church since the Counter-Reformation. A pastoral gathering. In his opening address in 1962, John called on the Council to take account of the errors, requirements, and opportunities of the age, and regretted that some people seem unable to see any good in the modern world. He called it prophets of gloom. At the same time, he affirmed the infallibility of the Church and said that her dogmas were settled and known to all, so that the conciliar task was merely one of presenting those dogmas in new ways. But the papal proclamation was ambiguous in ways that would turn out to characterize the council and its results even more. What was authentic, renewal, and how it was to be achieved. How should this essential discipline be adjusted to modern culture? Even a pastoral council had to be clear about its belief. Contrary to what John apparently intended, Vatican II ended up giving much of its attention to the internal life of the Church, a scrutiny that resulted in a crisis of Catholic identity without historical parallel. John died after the first session of the council and was succeeded by Cardinal Giovanni Battista Montini of Milan, who ruled as Paul VI. He ruled from 1963 to 1978. Vatican II. Public interest. Vatican II met in a glare of publicity greater even than Vatican I, including the press all over the world and the relative new electronic media. The intense interest that even many non-Catholics took in the proceedings was an acknowledgement of the Church's importance, albeit in some ways an ambiguous compliment. It was the best attended council in history, composed of 2,500 bishops and 150 superiors of male religious orders from all over the world, plus innumerable official observers and periti, or specialists who advise the voting delegates on the matters of theology and canon law. The agenda. There was a crisis from the beginning when many of the council's fathers objected to the work of the various preparatory commissions, mainly members of Roman Curia that had been set up to formulate the schema or agenda of the council. The tension arose from the desire of many fathers to open discussions as widely as possible without restriction. John acquiesced in the demands of the new schema, which were then formulated mainly by committees of the council fathers themselves. Blocks. The fathers were by no means of one mind. They were various blocks working to achieve diverse goals, often in opposition to one another, but the procedural squabble was in many ways the decisive event of the council, representing a crucial victory of what was now being called the Liberal Party. Progressives. The leadership of that party and in many ways of the council itself came mainly from 5 Western European councils, the most influential prelates being Cardinal Bernard Afrink of the Netherlands, Leo Joseph Swenens of Belgium, Achille Linhart of France, Julius Duckner, and Joseph Frings of Germany, and Franz Koenig of Austria. The majority of the council fathers tended to defer to the opinion of those prelates and a few others, such as Cardinal Giacomo Lercaro of Bologna. Theologians. Over the previous century, those 5 countries had nourished the most vigorous and sophisticated Catholic intellectual life, and as theological questions arose, bishops were influenced by the men recognized as the most accomplished theologians of the age. The Jesuits Henry de Lubac and Jean Danilou, the Oratorian Louis Boyer, and the Dominican Yves Congar in the France, the Dominican Edward Schillebeeckx in the Netherlands, the Jesuit Karl Rahner, the Redemptorist Bernard Haring, and the diocesan priest Joseph Ratzinger in Germany. These pereti were influential both in shaping the thought of the prelates whom they advised and in working behind the scenes with other bishops and pereti. The influence of this Northern European group was due partly to their well-organized effort to shape the discussions. But despite its intellectual brilliance, in some ways the church in Western Europe appeared less than vigorous in terms such as church attendance and religious vocations. Some countries in France in particular seemed top-heavy, rich in intellectual life but with an eroding popular base, so that their vigorous intellectuality was partly motivated by a certain sense of crisis, the urgent need to make the faith more credible to modern men. By contrast, the church in the British Isles, Southern Europe, Austria, Australia, Canada, and the United States, to say nothing of the Third World, lacked great intellectual achievements but appeared to be in relativity healthy pastoral states. Most of the bishops from these countries seem to see little urgency in many of the questions that came before them, and some expressed bewilderment as to why change was necessary at all. Conservatives, open resistance to the prevailing conciliar spirit, come to some diocesan bishops, notably Cardinal Joseph Seri of Genoa, but especially from certain members of the Roman Curia, such as Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, prefect of the Holy Office, whose primary responsibility was to safeguard doctrinal orthodoxy. In the end, most of the conciliar decrees were consciously balanced, opened by very careful choice of words. This balance would later allow both liberals and conservatives to claim conciliar authority to their interpretations. Authority. Ironically, in the view of latter claim that the council democratized the church, deference to authority was a major factor in determining the outcome. Papal leadership and an unquestioned faith in church inerrancy led most of the fathers to support the final decrees that emerged from the debates. The decree received more than a small number of dissenting votes. Theological currents preceding the council. Although many of the actions of the council took the world by surprise, all of them grew out of ideas that perhaps little known to most Catholics had been coming to fruition for a long time. Modernism, as condemned in 1907, had been only a marginal influence in the church, and it did not survive in an organized way. However, the modernists raised questions to which later thinkers sometimes returned, usually without being conscious modernists. Those questions were fundamental, whether belief transcended the historical era in which they were formulated, whether it was necessary to adapt those beliefs to the spirit of each age, and to what extent belief was the product of a human religious sense rather than of supernatural revelation. Whether modern scholarship, especially biblical studies, had discredited certain beliefs, and whether the Catholic faith had to be understood only in terms of Thomistic theology and philosophy. Resourcement. The situation was complex. While most theologians were Thomists, some, especially in France and Germany, were moving in other directions. Their principal approach came to be called resourcement, or recovery of the sources, a return to the church's scriptural and patristic roots during the millennium before the advent of scholasticism was being advocated by Delubac, Danilou, Bouyer, Congar, Ratzinger, and the Swiss priest theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. There was often a strong Thomistic reaction against this theology based on ressourcement, and the dispute between the different approaches to faith resembled that between scholastics and humanists at the time of the Renaissance. The proponents of the new theology is scholasticism, while true was abstract and remote, whereas Thomists taught that the new theology was dangerously imprecise, providing no objective basis for faith. Delubac. Following Augustine, Delubac argued that the distinction between reason and faith did not take sufficient account of the inherent human yearning for God and thereby unwittingly help prepare the way to secularization. This theory had aroused suspicion against both Rosmini and Blondel on the grounds that they did not recognize the necessity of divine grace in order to know God, and Delubac was accused of softening the distinction between the natural and the supernatural to the point of obliteration, making faith seems the almost natural human phenomenon. Pius XII's 1950 encyclicals, Humani Generis, the human race, was a check on the new theology, seeming to criticize Delubac without naming him, explicitly warning against assuming the theory of evolution to be true, and that insisting that the doctrine of original sin required not the human race be descended from a single set of parents. Partly because of this papal warning, until the time of Vatican II, the new theology was taught primarily in a few Jesuit and Dominican theologians in Europe, with Thomism continuing to dominate most seminaries and universities. But by the time of the Council, Delubac's orthodoxy was no longer in question, and the influence of ressourcement was obvious in all the conciliar decrees, especially their strong scriptural foundations. Aggiornamento. A few new theological approach, which was later called aggiornamento or updating, moved in the direction of modernism by making the demands of contemporary culture its chief concern. Aggiornamento owed such to the Canadian Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan, who distinguished the classical from the historical mentality, arguing that the former, a belief in a stable and unchanging mental universe, was now discredited and that theology had to operate within the historical mode. This question of changing mentality, Newman had tried to resolve by his theory of development of doctrine. Transcendental Thomism. Transcendental Thomism was an alternative to the mainstream Thomism of Gilson and Maritain. It originated at Louvain University and sought to take account of Kant's claim that the mind cannot know things in themselves but only phenomena that present themselves to the mind's own category. This is time, space, causality, and other things. Transcendental Thomism was so called because it's posited a fundamental affinity for God within the human soul that allowed men to transcend ordinary knowledge. Runner was a transcendental Thomist and emphasized this inherent human ability to know God, even speaking of the anonymous Christian who in effect possessed the faith without being aware of it. A theory that went much further than Delubac and marked a clear departure from the theology of ressourcement. Although Runner shared some of the interests of ressourcement, he became the intellectual leader of Aggiornamento, the related incarnational theology, so-called because it claimed to take seriously the fact that God entered human history in Jesus, made human experience rather than classical dogma the center of theological speculation. Phenomenology. Although the most theologians of ressourcement were only secondarily interested in moral theology, Catholic moral teaching also underwent development prior to the Council, although more of the hands of philosophers than of theologians. The Jewish Edmund Husserl was the founder of Phenomenology, a philosophy sought to understand reality as it was actually experienced by men. On the border between objectivity and subjectivity, it proves especially insightful into human relationship. Phenomenology appealed to some Catholics. Edith Stein was Husserl's student. Phenomenology was appealed as a corrective to scientific materialism in that even physical objects retain a spiritual significance that science could not understand. A house not merely a material structure but had a special meaning of those who inhabited it. This philosophy had a special relevance to marriage, beginning with the German layman Dietrich von Hildebrand, who was also a student of Husserl and who emigrated to the United States to escape the Nazis. Hildebrand spoke of marriage, dual purpose, the procreation of children that was its objective reality, and the spiritual unity of the spouses that was the experience at its heart. Sex without love, even between married persons, was therefore a moral disorder, and the union of the spouses was the highest good of marriage, reaching its ultimate fulfillment in begetting of the children. Personalism. Influenced by Blondel, in particular, the French layman Emmanuel Mounier articulated that he called personalism a philosophy in which truth was known not abstractly but by an intuition and the inexhaustible mystery and inner freedom of the person. Personalism's practical significance was uncertain, and that at different times Mounier was sympathetic to both fascism and communism. He became increasingly critical of the Catholic Church. Personalist moral theologians rejected traditional casuistry as minimalist approach to morality, since God called his people to perfect love, not merely to merely to the avoidance of sin. On birth control and other issues, there were stirrings of dissatisfaction in Western Europe, especially. There was a growing sense that the church needed to try new ideas in order to stem the religious decline. The conciliar decrees, revelation, and biblical studies. Although scholarly biblical studies are not sometimes generated skepticism, Louis XIII affirmed in principle the legitimacy of archaeology, history, and linguistics, provided they were undertaken in the spirit of faith. He authorized the establishment of Dominican École Biblique, School of the Bible, in Jerusalem under Marie-Joseph Lagrange, and set up the Pontifical Biblical Commission to encourage and oversee such studies. Under Pius X, the Pontifical Biblical Institute was established in Rome under Jesuits' auspices. Pius XII also gave qualified approval to biblical scholarships, reminding Catholics that while the Bible was divinely inspired, it was written through human agencies, making scholarship crucial in things as archaeological discoveries, the precise meaning of words, and the historical context in which biblical events occurred. During the 1950s, scholars at the École Biblique produced the Jerusalem Bible, a rendering of the scripture in modern French that was soon translated into English and began to supplant the Douay-Rheims edition that had been in use for 350 years. Over the next several decades, there was a proliferation of a new biblical translation in many languages, and the Catholics even began using Protestant versions. Vatican II strongly urged Catholics to make Scripture the center of their spiritual lives reminding them that the truth of Scripture were salvific, those things God had revealed to man for the sake of his salvation. The Scriptures were both divine and human in their authorship, and human error could enter in on matter that were not salvific. Tradition. There was, however, sharp debate over the nature of revelation, with some fathers fearful that an emphasis of Scripture alone would undercut certain Catholics' beliefs that had been come down through tradition. The example of this is the Assumption. In the end, the Council reaffirmed the authority of tradition, which had been a major point of contention between Catholics and Protestants since the Reformation, but returned to the patristic understanding of tradition not as a sort of authority separate from Scripture, but precisely as the Church's own understanding of Scripture. The Bible as received not by individuals, but by the ecclesial community guided by the Holy Spirit. The Church, the mystical body. The theology of church was basic concern of the council, the foundation on which everything else would be built. The recovery of the concept of mystical body of Christ, expounded by St. Paul, was one of the achievements of the 19th century theology confirmed by Pius XII in 1943. It moved beyond thinking of the church primarily in juridical or institutional terms as a formal organization with members and rules, and sought to recover a sense of her as a spiritual entity that transcended her institutional structure. Properly understood, this required a deeper kind of spirituality, not merely living piously and morally in order to receive grace, but entering into mystical union with Christ himself, in which a person embraces dying and rising with Christ in order sorry. Sandali po ha. Nawala yung kuwang ko. Okay lang po ba yung nakita nyo?
Okay lang po, okay lang. Sige.
Okay lang.
Opo.
Sandali po, nagdulo ko sa side ko.
Sige lang po. Na-mention sa presentation yung canonical reading. According to the way the church received it. Very good.
Okay. Other models. In its decree on Church Lumen Gentium, or Light of the Nations, the Council invoked other images beside that of the mystical body, the Church as the people of God. The new Israel of Christ's followers bound together by faith, and the pilgrim church, those pursuing their journey toward the heavenly Jerusalem, a reminder that men had no earthly dwelling. Hierarchy. Hierarchy was integral to the doctrine of the mystical body, since, as St. Paul said, no part of the body could claim to act independent of the others, and the whole body was governed by its head. But the relationship between hierarchical authority and shared authority, or collegiality, collegiality was reopened at the Vatican II because Vatican I had defined only the authority of the papal office, not that of the bishops. Collegiality. Lumen Gentium defined Episcopal collegiality to mean that bishops were not simply agents of the Holy See, but had apostolic authority in their own right. Historically, they had often acted in concert, especially in the Ecumenical Council. But some council fathers were fearful that this might be understood as a revival of late medieval conciliarism. Paul VI personally intervened to ensure that in Lumen Gentium Episcopal authority was limited by the dogma of papal infallibility, forthrightly asserting that while it was appropriate that the Holy Father consults bishops in the exercise of his Petrine office, his authority was valid without episcopal affirmation. This is in fact no pope had ever made a solemn doctrinal declaration without consulting the bishops. Most such declarations have been made by councils. Scarcely touched by the council was the question of how the idea of collegiality applied to other levels of the church. Morality, contraception. Organized promotion of birth control grew throughout the 20th century, and in 1930, Pius XI issued the encyclical Casti Connubii, Just Marriage, the most complete exposition to date of Catholic theology of marriage. The encyclical reaffirmed the Catholic teachings on contraception only a few months after the Church of England became the first Christian body to justify the practice officially, although the Anglican bishop warned that it could be used only for grave reasons. Rhythm. Catholic personalists were far from justifying contraception. However, their philosophies imply that although procreation could never be deliberately thwarted, something that would constitute a violent disruption of marital union, that not every sex act had to be potentially procreative. The marriage of sterile couples or of couples too old to beget children was always permitted by the Church. Some traditional Catholic moralists questioned the legitimacy of what then called the rhythm method, temporarily limiting sexual relations to the infertile periods that occur naturally in a woman's menstrual cycle. But Pius XII in 1951 declared it to be illicit if used to good reasons, including poverty or ill health. The pill. By the time of the council, there was considerable agitation for the church to accept at least some kinds of artificial birth control, especially the new developed pill, which produced in the woman as an artificial infertility. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the pill was even endorsed by several bishops. Paul VI intervened to take the issue off the floor of the council, appointing a special commission to study it. In its decree, Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope, the council explicitly recognized the dual purpose of marriage as both procreation and the loving union of spouses. Priesthood and religious life. Worker priest. During the Second World War, a number of priests were sent to concentration camps where they ministered to other prisoners under extreme conditions outside the normal structure of priestly life. In France, some priests were forced to work in factories during the war, and with direct experience of the falling away of so many industrial workers from the church, voluntarily returned to such jobs after the war, living together in small communities and hoping to evangelize the workers. The worker priest experiment was cautiously approved by the hierarchy, but in a way it turned out to be symptomatic of the fallacy of much post-war liberal Catholicism, bold and imaginative, but pastorally ineffective. Few workers were attracted back to the church Some priests abandoned their vocations and others embraced Marxism that was deeply embedded in the French working class. The Holy See first imposed restrictions and eventually suppressed the experiment. Significant in terms of his liberal image, it was John the 23rd who did so. Celibacy. Most priests of the time seem to have been living faithfully and zealously, and the council's decree on priesthood affirmed traditional discipline. A few council fathers raised the issue of celibacy, but Paul VI forbade its discussion. Religious life. Noting the decline in European religious vocations after the war, Pius XII urged modernization of religious life, albeit in accord with its traditional purposes. The council prescribed both ressourcement and aggiornamento for the renewal of religious life, enjoining religious communities to return to the original vision of their founders, but also to make prudent adjustment to modern life. The laity call to holiness. The council's principal message to both the clergy and the laity was the universal call to holiness in whatever one's state of life. The council recalled Paul's teaching about the priesthood of the laity, that they joined with the priest in offering the holy sacrifice, an idea that had been almost forgotten as a result of the Protestant insistence of the priesthood of all believers. Lay apostolic. Through Catholic action and other movements, lay activity had been continually growing during the 20th century. The Legion of Mary, founded by layman Frank Duff in Dublin in 1921, was a major apostolate in many parts of the world. Its members working especially among the poor, with prostitutes, and with those who have lapsed from the faith. In England, two primary lay groups, the Catholic Evidence Guild and the Catholic Truth Society, aggressively championed the church in a somewhat hostile environment, with the former group witnessing to the faith while standing on actual soapboxes taking on all comers. There were few lay theologians before the council, Frank Sheed, an able popularizer, being one of the very few, but laymen were active in every other area of Catholic intellectual life. Apostolic Monday. In defining the role of laity, Vatican II, for the most part, adopted the Catholic action concept, focusing entirely on the apostolic mandate of the laity, who were enabled by the baptism to engage in evangelization to renew the temporal world. It is said nothing about the participation of the laity in the governance of the church. Liturgy. Of all the changes wrought by council, none were more dramatic and far-reaching than those in the liturgy. Emperor Joseph II and other reformers of the Enlightenment period wanted to simplify the sacred rites to make them, in a sense, more efficient, and they even discussed the use of the vernacular. But their program ended with the French Revolution and had no influence on what later called the liturgical movement. The liturgical movement. That movement began with Prosper Geringer in the monastery of Celemes in the 19th century. In attempting as far as possible to recreate monastic life as it was lived in the Middle Ages, he placed the liturgy once more at the center of Catholic life. His multi-volume work, The Liturgical Year, being the first modern attempt to encourage a piety centered on liturgy. The liturgical movement continued to develop principally in Benedictine monasteries in Germany and Belgium, and was brought to the United States mainly through St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. The movement was primarily monastic because of the celebration of the Mass, and the divine office had always been the monk's principal task, and they possessed both the education and the time to celebrate the liturgy in all its fullness. Gregorian Chant. Part of Geringer's program was the revival of Gregorian Chant, which had all but disappeared from Catholic worship. The music of the High Mass was often written by contemporary composers and performed by professional orchestras and choruses, while in ordinary parishes, the musical consisted mainly of pious hymns. Pius X. Pius X came to considered patron of the liturgical movement because he both strongly endorsed the revival of chant and strongly encouraged frequent communion. He allowed children to make their first communions at an early age and thereby went against Jansenist prejudices that prevailed even among many people who were not Jansenists. The sacred mysteries. Gallenger's idea of authentic liturgy was a romantic kind of medievalism, but later scholars sought to recover the worship of the early church, concluding that over the centuries numerous accretions had developed that obscured its original meaning. The Italian-German priest Romano Guardini was the most important theologian of the liturgical movement, relating liturgy to the most basic mysteries of the faith and showing it as the center of Catholic life. Based on the theology of mystical body, the German Benedictine Odo Kassel explained the liturgy as not only the continuation of the sacrifice of Calvary through in which the faithful receive grace, but as a divine mystery into which the faithful fully enter in order to die and rise with Christ. The liturgical calendar. To achieve this, liturgies emphasize the seasonal cycle: Christmas, Epiphany, Holy Week, Pentecost, over the sanctorial cycle that commemorated the saints, and they also sought to limit the frequency of masses for the dead, which in many parishes made up most of the weekend liturgies. In each case, the proper celebration of the liturgy was in tension with popular devotion. Pius XII sent to give his blessing to the liturgical movement when in 1951, he authorized the restoration of the Easter Vigil to its proper place on Holy Saturday evening or early Easter morning, replacing the anomalous custom of celebrating it on Saturday morning. It was a especially significant reform that was intended to make Paschal mystery the heart of the Christian life. Social dimension. The liturgical movement also had a strong social dimension, teaching that in the liturgy, both individuals and the community are transformed, so that they in turn can transform the world at the most profound level, elevating people to a higher level of being and meeting the most desperate of all human needs, salvation from the powers of darkness. In the United States, especially through Benedictine Virgil Michel of Collegeville, interest in liturgy was often linked with racial justice and other social issues. Active participation, worshippers had always believed that something of eternal significance was taking place on the altar, and Christ himself was present, and most people assisted at Mass in spirit of deep reverence, even if they did not fully comprehend it. But the achievement of what Pius X called active participation in the liturgy by the laity was the chief purpose of the liturgical movement, with participation understood as being present in prayerful spirit, attending closely to the rites and understanding their meaning, although not necessarily singing and praying along with the priest. Slowly, the liturgical movement moved beyond the monasteries, awakening in some priests and laity a new appreciation of the liturgy at a time when many people probably found popular devotions more meaningful. Overall, however, the movement had only modest impact. A small minority of lay people used bilingual daily missals that enabled them to pray the Mass with the priest. A very few began to pray the daily divine office, and in advanced circles, the dialogue Mass allowed the congregation to make the Latin responses that were ordinarily rendered only by the acolytes. Some liturgies favored use of the vernacular, but it was not a central issue. The vernacular. The conciliar decree on liturgy embodied the rich theology that lay behind all this. speaking of liturgy in mystical way as a foretaste of New Jerusalem, a glimpse of heaven itself. Of all the things which Vatican II is known, the movement from Latin to the vernacular is perhaps most famous, but in fact the Council did not mandate that move, but merely conceded that under some circumstances, the vernacular might be appropriate in some parts of the liturgy. Garinger gave pride of place to Gregorian chant, which had been neglected. But newer styles of music were also encouraged. Mary. Marian piety flourished in the 20th century, and some bishop wanted the council to issue a special decree on Mary, even to proclaim her as co-redemptrix with Jesus. Instead, the council included a statement about Mary in Lumen Gentium, defining her role within the total economy of salvation, in order to overcome any belief that Mary offered a way alternative to Christ's own redemptive sacrifice. Ecumenism. Next to liturgy, ecumenism was perhaps the council's most dramatic legacy. The economical movement was a Protestant and to a much lesser extent, Eastern Orthodox development of the early 20th century. By the end of the century, however, the movement was being led by the Catholic Church. The economical movement. Pius bluntly told the Protestants that Vatican I was yet another opportunity for them to repent their errors. And that Benedict XV and Pius XI warned against the danger of seeming to make religious belief the subject of negotiations. As a result of the Oxford movement, there was some economical rapprochement between Catholics and High Church Anglicans. Although Leo XIII, after the study, pronounced the Anglican orders absolutely null and utterly void. During the 1920s, there were unofficial Catholic Anglican discussions tolerated by the Holy See under the patronage of Cardinal Mercier. That is the Marine's conversation. Unofficial encounters. During World War II, some informal ecumenism developed between Protestants and Catholic engaged in struggle against the Nazis in Germany. The Netherlands and France, and in England, there was a formal economical organization, the Sword of the Spirit, not for a time enjoyed hierarchical approval. After the war, both Catholic and Protestant scholars began writing accounts of the Reformation that sought understanding rather than mere polemics. Boyer, a convert from very small French Lutheran church, was especially influential in the Catholic side. In 1949, a Boston priest, Leonard Finney, was first expelled from the Jesuit order, then excommunicated for persisting in his teaching that no one who is not a Catholic can be saved, starting a schismatic movement that was only reconciled to the church decades later. John the 23rd began the Catholic economical initiatives before the council, largely by his personal openness to non-Catholics whom he addressed as brother. The Holy See had declined to join the World Council of Churches when it was formed in 1948, but in 1961 it began sending observers to its meeting. John established the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity under Jesuit Cardinal Agostino Bea, Pius XII's former confessor. Protestant and Eastern Orthodox were invited to send observers to the council, their presence making Vatican II unique among the councils. Religious truth. The council itself identified religious truth as present in what was in effect a series of overlapping circles with all Christian faiths possessing some degree of truth, but the fullness of Christ's truth present only in the Catholic Church. The new ecumenism appeared revolutionary to many, a complete reversal of what had previously been taught. It was, however, a merely change of perspective in that the Catholic Church had always recognized the core of orthodoxy in Protestantism, but had previously emphasized its errors. Now she chose to recognize its truth as the basis of a perfect brotherly unity. Eastern Orthodoxy. Economical priority was inevitably given to Eastern Orthodox who were recognized as sharing most of the Catholic faith. Separation from the Orthodox was viewed by the Council's fathers as a lamentable historical misfortune, and the mutual excommunication of 1054 were formally rescinded after the Council. Protestants. The Council warned against a false ecumenism based on the indifference or a misinterpretation of doctrine. However, under various direction, official dialogues were initiated, especially with the Lutherans and Anglicans. In practical terms, the immediate effect of ecumenism was to alter Catholics and Protestants' attitudes to one another. As for the first time, they were allowed, even encouraged, to pray together, both formally and informally, although they could not share the Eucharist. The Jews. The conciliar decree on the Jews reaffirmed that the death of Jesus was the fault of the entire sinful human race, not of the Jews specifically, and recalled the Jews' status as God-chosen people and the role of their faith in the economy salvation. That is, some Near Eastern bishops spoke against the decree because it would offend their people. Pope John personally ordered the expunging of the term perfidious Jews from the Liturgy of Good Friday. Non-Christians. The Church approach to non-Christian religions required not ecumenism, which applies only to Christians, but some kind of inter-religious dialogue based on natural theology, which posits the possibility of men to know the existence of their Creator. Thus, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other religions were said to possess a core of the truth, although they remain in need of the gospel. Church and world sympathy. Gaudium et Spes, usually called the church in the modern world, was often identified as the heart of the Council's message, the Charter of Aggiornamento. Its tone differed from many earlier church documents in that it did not primarily warn or condemn, but instead expressed sympathy and understanding for a world that possessed an unfulfilled longing for truth and justice. Characteristic of the optimistic tone, Gaudium et Spes made only oblique references to the fact that the 20th century had already seen a persecution of Christians more severe than any in the entire history of church. Despite vigorous effort by some fathers, the Council did not condemn communism by name. A loving mother. In announcing Christ as the light of the nations, Lumen Gentium claimed for his church a position superior to that of every other institution, and in Gaudium et Spes, far from uncritically embracing the world, also boldly asserted the church superiority over secular culture. The burden of the conciliar message was that so long as men relied merely on their own resources to achieve good, they would always be disappointed that only the saving gospel of Christ could provide fulfillment. The church was like a loving mother, sympathetic but always providing the world with firm guidance. The Signs of Times. The title of the decree, Gaudium et Spes, taken from the first three Latin words of the text, was in a sense misleading, in that after joy and hope, the very next word were grief and anguish, loctos et anger, the juxtaposition of two phrases accurately expressing the balanced stance which the Council took towards the world. The Church, according to Gaudium et Spes, undertook to read the signs of the times, discerning in the movement of history how the world needed guidance, searching for what was positive in secular culture in order to build upon it. The council even dispassionately analyzed various kinds of atheism in order to understand their appeal. A wide agenda. By the far longest of the conciliar decrees, Gojomitspe attempted to deal with all aspects of modern world. The human sense of alienation, the economy, war and peace, the family, and many other things. It mandated economically developed nations to help poorer ones, condemned the arms race, and all wars against civilians, made blunt reference to the plague of divorce, the abominable crime of abortion, judged deliberately childless marriages to be a tragedy, and reminded the people of the church's condemnation of artificial birth control. Religious liberty, opposition. One of the actions of the council that attracted the most notice was its decree on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, human dignity, was also one of the most controversial within the church herself, drawing the largest number of negative votes of any conciliar document, albeit still only a small minority. The disapprobation of some council fathers reflected a long-standing Catholic view that religious liberty could only be justified for pragmatic reasons in those cases where it was not expedient to prohibit the practice of other faiths. Sorry. Murray and Maritain. These outlooks seem to place an unbridgeable gulf between the church and almost all modern Western societies, and it had been questioned especially by John Courtney Murray. After being under a cloud, Murray was brought to the council to the efforts of Cardinal Spellman, and he was the only American theologian to have any significant influence there. Maritain perhaps had even more influence on Dignitatis Humanae than did Murray, since Maritain, after having for a time been politically reactionary, became an enthusiastic supporter of democracy as the best of all political systems, giving the other possible choices. Human dignity. Properly understood, Dignitatis Humanae reaffirmed that error has no right, but also affirmed that men who may be in error do have rights. The decree's title sum up its teaching that the basis of toleration was not indifference to truth, but respect even more for those who might be in error. The church forswore coercion in matters of faith as violation of the spirit of the gospel, as most of the early fathers had done. Social doctrine. Since Quadragismo Anno, the popes had not been addressed social and economic question very directly. But the beginning with John 23rd, there were a series of encyclicals identifying such questions as crucial concern, applying Catholic principles to changing times. John 23rd. The social message of Gaudium et Spes had been anticipated by John 23rd. His Mater et Magistra, Mother and Teacher, 1961, was a strong restatement of the principles of distributive justice, and Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, 1963, called on the world to achieve lasting peace by transcending national and ideological difference. Both encyclicals were bids by the Church to play a formative role in resolving social problems, and they attracted a great deal of favorable response. John offered the Catholic principle as the basis for a just society everywhere because those principles were not merely church doctrine, but were based on natural law. Papal journeys. This claim to transcendent teaching authority was also symbolically manifest in the Pope's new role as public figure. John 23rd had broken with custom by leaving Rome. Now, beginning with the Holy Land, Paul VI made 9 world journeys while giving the papacy a new level of public recognition. Modernization. In the conciliar environment, certain concrete changes had lasting significance. the papacy and the papal administration were given an updated look that was more accommodating to modern sensibilities. Beginning with John going for an informality, the monarchical trappings of the papacy, such as the triple tiara and the coronation ceremony, were phased out. Later, the Pope would no longer be carried in his throne, but would walk in procession or be transported by a Pope mobile. Pope John Paul II, this is Pope Paul's innovation, the Pope mobile. The Curia. The Roman Curia was organized and permanent secretariats or pontifical councils were established for the laity, the family, Christian unity, non-Christians, and the dialogue with unbelievers, among other things. There have been demands for the internationalization of the Italian-dominated Curia, and Paul VI quickly moved to achieve that, partly in order to accommodate an increasing numbers of cardinals from outside Europe. The College of Cardinals was increased from 120 from the traditional number of 70. Freedom. The council seemed to encourage freer theological speculation. The index was abolished. The Holy Office was renamed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and those accused of unorthodox teaching were guaranteed a formal hearing. In the wake of the council, a time of crisis, Paul VI greatly admired Maritain, was sympathetic to the new theology, and thus seemed uniquely qualified to preside over the implementation of the council. But tragically, his pontificate would have proved to be in many ways a long series of crises at every level. Even though John the 23rd has said that the council would not issue new dogmatic decrees, the fact that practically every aspect of Catholic belief had come under discussion inevitably raised both expectation and fears. Before the council had been ended, there was widening disagreement as to its meaning. The first phrase of Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope, seemed to validate optimism, proclaiming the church's openness to the world, while its second phrase, Grief and Anguish, was largely ignored. But reading the signs of the times proved to be far more difficult than Gaudium et Spes foresaw in its measured judgment. The 60s, wholly unforeseen, just as the council ended, the worldwide cultural revelation called the 60s began. It was nothing less than a frontal assault on all forms of authority, and had the council been held a decade earlier during the more stable 1950s, it is likely that the post-conciliar upheaval would have been less severe. Liberation. Unrecognized at first, it soon became clear that attempting to counter secularism by moving closer to secular culture produced largely negative results. Modernization, rather than satisfying the discontented, merely whetted the appetite for more of the same. As had been happening to liberal Protestantism for some time, rates of church attendance and religious vocations among the Catholics began to fall, almost exactly in proportion to how progressive the church became. For many Catholics, the meaning of their faith now consisted mainly in continuous effort to free themselves from the past. Dialogue. Along with every crisis came newly popular idea of a dialogue. While in principle engaging in dialogue did not require the participants to surrender their own belief, but merely allowed them an opportunity to try to understand those of others in practice. In practice, it often had the effect of leaving all questions permanently open, as opposed to the exercise of teaching authority. Especially during the first 20 years of the council, a variety of formal dialogues were undertaken with various religions, with Marxists, but with relatively meager lasting results. Traditionalists. The first crisis occurred after the council's end, when the number of small groups calling themselves traditionalists questioned the council's authority, especially its decrees on liturgy, ecumenism, and religious liberty. The most important of these was the Society of St. Pius X, founded by the French Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who had been a papal nuncio in Africa, general of the Holy Ghost Fathers, and a participation in the council where he signed his name to all its decrees. The movement proved to be some importance in France but was marginal in most other places. To some extent, it had ties with those who advocated monarchy as the only legitimate form of government, and at one of its bishop, an English convert, was fiercely anti-Jewish. The SSPX started a seminary in Switzerland, and Lefebvre was first suspended from the Episcopal office for ordaining priests and sending them to set up schismatic parishes in various parts of the world, then excommunicated for consecrating bishops, both without canonical authority. Although this traditionalists went into schism, a graver crisis was caused by some who claimed to accept the authority of the council. Media. Given the immense media interest in the council's proceeding, it was perhaps less most important what the council did than what the people thought it did. Thus, certain bishops and periti entered into working alliances with certain journalists, with both becoming an effect participants observers, reporting the events and at the same time seeking to influence them, fixing in the popular mind a lasting impression of what the council was doing. The gist of such reporting was that at long last the church was admitting her many errors and coming to terms in modern culture. The council fathers were divided into heroes and villains, liberals and conservatives, and the conciliar deliberations were presented as morality plays which open-minded progressives repeatedly thwarted the plots of Machiavellian reactionaries. Consequently, people who understood almost nothing of theological issues believed that the council's real purpose was simply that of repealing rules that had become burdensome. Euphoria. Measuring the council's effect is difficult because many of the effects were matters of mood or tone rather than of concrete actions. The conciliar process itself proved to be a transforming experience for many people who may have given little previous thought to the questions that were discussed. A major psychological factor was the heady experience of swift and unexpected change. In 1960, almost no one predicted the virtual abandonment of Latin liturgy. For example, but when the council fathers seemed to support such a change, it became an irresistible temptation for some to continue pushing further and faster. As what was being taught as a stone walls of resistance turned out to be a paper mache. For many, the post-conciliar period therefore proved to be a time of brotherless experimentation, which change itself apparently now the only new certitude. In that environment, the distinction between essential and non-essential was for so many people no longer clear. If Catholics could now eat meat on Fridays, why could they not get divorced, especially if the purpose of the council and of the good Pope John was to make the faith less burdensome? But in other sense, at first not fully understood, the attention paid to externals was not disproportionate because in a sacramental religion, material things are doorways to the spirit. Thus, an aversion to Friday abstinence or to nuns' habits sometimes revealed something much deeper. Uncertain trumpets. Many of the council's fathers, after they returned to their dioceses, seemed themselves to uncertain as to what had been intended. Bishop Fulton Sheen, for example, while briefly serving as Bishop of Rochester, supported the most liberal of his priests and stated on television that the church might now permit contraception. Caught in the post-conciliar crossfire, he soon resigned his seat. On the whole, the bishop themselves made little systematic effort to catechize the faithful. This includes priests and religious on the council's meaning and relied instead on certified experts in every area of church life. As at the council itself, the traditional concept of obedience was used to persuade reluctant Catholics to conform to the new ways. Collegiality. Although Lumen Gentium clearly stated that episcopal authority could not be exercised except in union with the Holy See, collegiality was often problematic in the post-conciliar era. The chief way of exercising the collegiality was the newly established International Synod of Bishops held in Rome every 3 years to address particular questions with some of its members elected by their fellow bishops in each country, either appointed by the Pope. The synods themselves sometimes became the occasion for bishops to challenge papal authority, as Archbishop John R. Quinn of San Francisco did on one occasion. Episcopal Conferences. The concept of collegiality also led the hierarchy in various countries to form themselves into national regional conferences, and some national conferences appeared not to support certain official teachings such as that on birth control. The National Conference of Catholic Bishops, later United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, issued numerous public statements on national defense, on economic justice, on the pastoral care of homosexuals that were presented as the collective opinions of the hierarchy, but some bishops found seriously deficient. A crisis of faith, theological divisions. The theologies of ressourcement and argumento began to move in opposite directions very soon after the council, opening an increasingly unbridgeable chasm. Along with Skilibix, Hering, and to a lesser extent Runner, the German-Swiss priest theologian Hans Küng was the increasingly bold and abrasive chief spokesman for aggiornamento, demanding that the church accommodate herself to a changing culture, while de Lubac, Danilou, Maritain, Balthasar, Boyer, Ratzinger, and others protested that they considered distortions of the council. The conciliar spirit and the theology of aggiornamento. Where the council decrees did not explicitly support their agenda, some advocates of aggiornamento began to appeal to the council spirit, which was said to transcend in its actual decrees and in some cases might even contradict them. Thus, ironically, authority of the council was itself relativized. The ultimate question, which was reaffirmed eventually without discussion by the council itself, was whether the church teaches with divine authority or whether her doctrines merely represent human striving for some kind of transcendence. Some now understood the council in Hegelian and modern terms as merely an episode in the church unfolding, self-understanding, its function not to make authoritative pronouncement, but merely to facilitate the movement of the church into the next stage of historical development. A second magisterium. The existence of an authoritative magisterium that decides matter of doctrine was increasingly denied, either openly or implicitly, as a denial was especially aimed at papal authority. Theologians aggiornamento sometimes spoke of a second magisterium of theologians themselves, parallel to that of the hierarchy and ultimately having more authority than the hierarchy on the grounds that theologians alone fully understood the faith. In many ways, this topic is biblical studies. In many ways, the ultimate source of the crisis lay in biblical studies. While successive popes had encouraged such studies, Pius XII warned of the danger of an approach to the Bible entirely dependent on scholarly opinion and requiring the reader to present from the divine character of the scripture. Prior to the council, Catholic scholars had done their work in accord with such papal injunctions, but afterwards some of them speedily adopted precisely the methods against which Pius had warned. Largely as a result of the council, Catholics were encouraged to study the Bible as never before. But ironically, they were also often told that it was not an altogether reliable guide to knowledge of Jesus. Liberal Protestant exegetes had long been wedded to the historical critical method, and in the decades following the council, numerous new Catholic commentaries were published that employed that method. The historical critical method. In the principle, the method itself could lead reader to see the Old Testament not as prophetic, foreshadowing and preparing for the new, but to understand solely as a collection of documents about the Jews. The Gospels were said to have been composed long after Jesus' death by various local communities seeking to validate their own distinctive beliefs by claiming particular evangelists as the authors of their sacred books, emphasizing certain stories about Jesus at the expense of certain others. At first, it was suggested that the only infancy narratives might not be historical, whereas belief in Jesus' bodily resurrection was essential to the faith. Soon, however, it became increasingly difficult to draw such lines, and the resurrection itself was redefined in symbolic or psychological terms, such as the apostles witnessing to the deep and lasting impression Jesus had made on them. Gnostic Gospels. By the end of 20th century, liberal scholars had ceased to treat the New Testament even as a uniquely authoritative book for Christians, as the rediscovered text of the ancient Gnostic Gospels of Thomas, Philip, Judas, and others were given equally authority. This demythologizing especially occurred with respect to distinctively Catholic teachings, such as the claim that Jesus founded the church and gave Peter primacy over her, and that this is my body was to be understood literally. Logically, given their assumption of the Bible's errancy, some theologians of argumento claim that classic Catholic dogmas as found in the creeds and in the decrees of Nicaea and Chalcedon had ceased to be meaningful. The theology of argumento, Christology from below. Schillebeck expounded a Christology from below that, not explicitly denying the ancient creeds, presented from them in order to focus on modern people's experience of Jesus, who Jesus is for me. Schillebeck's approach would not allow for a clear affirmation of Jesus' divinity, and in practice led to a new kind of Arianism that spoke of him in terms like someone in whom God was present in a special way. The anonymous Christian. Raner was committed to aggiornamento in his principal concern was to reconcile the faith with modern German philosophy. His precise meaning was open and clear, but he was increasingly unwilling to affirm classical Catholic doctrine and increasingly hostile to the exercise of magisterial authority. His idea of anonymous Christian who embraced gospel values without perhaps realizing it made the need for the church seem problematic. Some theologians now distinguish the kingdom from the church, claiming that Christ's intention had been to establish not the latter but the former, the reign of truth and the justice on earth. Teilhard. Although he was not a theologian, the French Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin became for a time an influential figure of aggiornamento, formulating a theology based on what he considered to be the ultimate truth of modern science, a cosmic theology derived not only from human history, but from the evolution of the entire universe. Teilhard who died 7 years before the council began, had been ordered by his superiors not to publish his theories. After his death, this book began to appear, but they had no direct influence on the council's deliberation. In a man, according to Tilhard, the universe had evolved to a new level and now moved towards an omega point at which all difference would converge. Christogenesis, birth of Christ. That was the ultimate fulfillment of creation. Tilhard's theories bore some resemblance to the patristic doctrine of cosmic redemption, but he seemed to understand this transformation as a wholly natural process in which sin, and therefore the need for redemption, was transcended, and the universe underwent a kind of pantheistic divinization. Although his influence gradually waned, Tilhard enjoyed a significant vogue in 2 decades following the council, not least because he seemed to provide both a scientific and a theological foundation for the spirit of optimistic euphoria. He was rhapsodic over the atomic bomb as a dramatic manifestation of new powers being unleashed, and he subscribed to theories of racial superiority. In private, he was scathing in his condemnation of much of the Catholic theologian tradition. Morality. The theology of aggiornamento had its greatest impact in morals, where the spirit of dissent took hold because of its immediate practical implications, especially for sexuality. The old casuistry was a system of rules and laws that provided people with concrete direction, and once those rules had been de-emphasized, many people become morally confused. Self-fulfillment. Reversing traditionally spiritual emphasis was now placed on the idea of self-fulfillment as a necessary condition for psychological health. In effect, a revival of Pelagianism with wholly optimistic view of human nature. In many places, the practice of compassion all but disappeared. Conscience. Hearing the American priest theologian Charles Curran and others now began to excite people's lives experience to justify behavior primarily sexual that had previously been considered sinful. The individual conscience was turned into an absolute, and the traditional teaching that conscience must report in accord with objective morality was largely ignored. Moral relativism. Situation ethics, as developed by liberal Protestants and adopted by some Catholics, denied absolute moral laws and evaluated the morality of acts primarily on the basis of circumstances, the motives of the people involved, their particular problems, even such things as their gender and social class. Consequentialism is essentially the principle that the end justifies the means. Judge the morality of actions primarily on the basis of their likely results. Contraception. Birth control was the crucial issue that required Catholics to decide whether they recognize the Church as an authoritative moral teacher. The fact that Paul VI set up a special commission to study the question led many people to assume that church authorities themselves were uncertain and that the teaching was therefore about to change. Although their work was supposed to be confidential, in 1966, some members of the commission revealed to the media that a majority recommended acceptance of contraception, thereby heightening the expectation of change. At first, some Catholics thought that if the Church acknowledged error in her teaching about birth control, her credibility on other moral issues would be preserved, or that the contraception could be permitted only to married couples and then only to postpone pregnancy, not to prevent it altogether. These positions proved to be untenable. However, as the sexual revolution burst on the Western world as nothing less than a denial of traditional sexual morality in all its aspects. The contraceptive culture for the first time in history, completely severed the connection between sex and procreation and defined sex as existing primarily for the sake of pleasure. Catholics as a whole had begun to engage in sexual behavior that measurably different from that of the non-believers. The Catholic divorce rate rose to the level of general population, and the number of ecclesiastical annulments increased geometrically. When Paul finally issued Humanae Vitae in 1968, affirming the traditional teaching, there was an explosive rebellion orchestrated in the United States by prominent theologians led by Curran. Education. Based on the new theological currents, religious education at all levels underwent a post-conciliar revolution. The Thomistic establishment swiftly and the Catholic institution of higher education become centers of eclectic philosophy and dissenting theology. Shortly after the council, a group of Catholic university presidents in the United States declared independence from the church authority. Some Catholic institutions went out of existence and some became officially secular, while most continued to claim Catholic identity that was vague and undefined. Seminaries were not unaffected, and a generation of priests was trained in an environment in which theological dissent enjoyed as much authority as official teaching. Catechetics. The nature of catechetics have been under revision for some time, especially promoted by the Lumen Vitae, the Light of Life, Center in Brussels. Instead of the traditional approach in which students learn doctrines, the new catechetics promise to inculcate in them a lively personal faith through Bible study, liturgy, and many other things, paying close attention to the psychology of the students and the pedagogical methods appropriate to their ages. On the assumption that all education has to resonate with the students' own experience, the new catechetics tended to minimize distinctive Catholic beliefs, even to the point of treating formal doctrine as an obstacle to living faith. The result was several generations of young Catholics who had never been taught of the essentials of their faith and tended to understand primarily as vague kind of humanitarianism. Liturgy. Now, nowhere was the post-conciliar tension between aggiornamento and ressourcement more pronounced than with regard to the liturgy. The liturgical movement has struggled for the decades to make Catholics appreciate the Eucharist at the center of their lives. But once liturgical reforms had been enacted, participation in the Eucharist fell off sharply almost everywhere. Responsibility for implementing liturgical reform was given to the Concilium, a committee whose work received at least the passive acquiescence of the Holy See. The key figure was the Italian Vincentian Archbishop Annibale Bognini. The demise of Latin. The normative text of Novus Ordo, New Order. Mass was in Latin, and it was celebrated in Latin at papal ceremonies. But most Catholics were unaware that a Latin liturgy of any kind was still permitted. Both Latin and Gregorian Chant all but disappeared. The new Mass constituted the most sweeping liturgical changes ever implemented, so brief in a time. Versus Populum. The next, the vernacular, perhaps the most significant innovation was Mass celebrated versus populum, or facing the people. Something which, like the vernacular, was not mandated by the council but soon became all but universal. To make this possible, permanent altars were often removed from the churches and replaced by freestanding wooden tables. Dramatic changes. Other dramatic changes to the Mass included placing the sacred vessels on the side table at the beginning of the Mass rather than having them veiled on the altar, allowing laymen to handle those vessels, offering the chalice to the laity in communion. The abolition of the prayers at the foot of the altar at the beginning of the Mass and of the last Gospel at the end of Liturgy of the Word, no longer conducted by the priest of the altar, and the abolition of the solemn high Mass in which the celebrant was assisted by deacon, subdeacon, and other ministers. The council restored the office of permanent deacon, but abolished the sub-diaconing. Pruning. The concilium suppressed a large part of the Tridentine rite. Purified the Mass were deemed excessive genuflection, sign of the cross, repetitive prayers, and authorized vernacular translation that were not literally faithful to the official Latin text but sought instead for dynamic equivalency. Old churches were often ruthlessly stripped of their side altars, statues, stations of the cross, and other things in order to minimize the Romanesque, Gothic, or Baroque styles that would then no longer speak to modern man. Active participation. Active participation was now taken to mean that the congregation must join vocally in all prayers, not exclusive to the priests and most hymns. Liturgies emphasize the communal nature of the Mass to the point of strongly discouraging, if not actually forbidding, priests from celebrating Mass in private, and concelebration by more than one priest was restored for the first time since the early centuries. The divine office was also translated into the vernacular and substantially revised, including the wider variety of readings of them from modern sources. The discouragement of private masses raised questions about the meaning of the Mass itself. Traditionally, it was communal act in the sense that it was celebrated for the benefit of people who were not physically present, especially for the dead. Now, however, it seemed to be celebration only of those who are actually present. Funerals. The requiem was suppressed in favor of the funeral liturgy as the joyful celebration of resurrection. There were, however, theological difficulties. Exclusively emphasized on resurrections seem to imply that the deceased was already in paradise, so that the funeral homily often functioned as a eulogy of the deceased, and the practice of praying for the dead seemed unnecessary. Devotions. Liturgists judge that for most Catholic, the heart of faith lay in pious devotions rather than the Mass, and the Council warned against an overemphasis of such devotions while also calling for their preservation. But as with Latin chant, many of those devotions disappeared completely, their suppression creating a subjective spiritual hunger that the liturgy itself did not entirely satisfy. A modern style. Changes were initially justified as a return to the practices of the early church, thus to a presumably more authentic manner of celebration. Soon, however, liturgies began the systematic introduction of modern modes of celebration in language, music, symbolism, and other things, seeking to make liturgy relevant by the emphasizing its mystical elements and assimilating it to a contemporary culture. Active participation can to be measured by the subjective effects the liturgy had on its participants through the use of contemporary language, new ritual practices like balloons and dancing, and folk music in commercially popular styles. Creativity. Primary emphasis was now placed in Eucharist as a community meal, so that for some people the greetings of peace, which had not been part of the Tridentine Mass, became the high point of the celebration. The inevitable logic of drive to make liturgy relevant was the idea that each congregation should create its own liturgy. Although the council explicitly forbade priests to make changes in the rites, Bugnini himself urged toleration of unauthorized experimentation. Though some congregation composed their own prayers, chose their own readings, and dispensed with vestments and other signs of the sacred. Religious life. In some ways, the severest crisis in post-conciliar period was in priestly and religious life, a crisis that went to very identify of those states, as in the practice of referring to the celebrant of the Mass as the presider, thereby minimizing the sacerdotal status and making him primarily a representative of the community. The vocation of priests and religious was now defined primarily as that of service, which made renunciation for the sake of kingdom Celibacy, especially sin, burdensome. The decline of discipline. Priests and religious gave up their vocations in large numbers, and even many of those who remained were troubled. Religious discipline, which had not been at the high level on the above council, declined sharply, as heterosexual relationship was not uncommon, and homosexuality among priests came to be a serious problem. Bishops showed a certain reluctance to deal with it, even when the Holy See ordered that non-homosexuals not be admitted to seminaries, and several bishops were themselves implicated. Sisters, before the council, women religious were probably more devout and lived more austerely than priests. But on the whole, they also had less education, so that at first they depended heavily on male leadership to guide them through post-conciliar change. Cardinal Swinens wrote an influential book urging sisters to come out of their cloisters. Renewal. Renewal is at first promise a phenomenal revitalization of religious orders, including dramatic numerical growth. If sisters modified or discarded their traditional habits, liberalized their strict discipline, and ventured into new apostolates. The council injunction to religious to rediscover their own original charism was largely disregarded, a prime example of aggiornamento overcoming resourcement. Communities of women who for centuries had run schools and hospitals now abandoned those ministries, thereby causing a major crisis in Catholic education and healthcare. Democracy. The idea of self-fulfillment as a necessary condition for physical health was novelty in religious life and rendered the very concept of obedience unacceptable, so that some communities no longer spoke of superiors but of presidents or leaders. The modification then, the abandonment of traditional religious habits, marked the beginning of the end of religious life as it had existed for centuries. Instead of growth, the number of sisters in the United States climbed over 65% in the period from 1965 to 2010, with comparable declines in all other Western countries. In many communities, vocation all but ceased. A noted failure. The most celebrated renewal history in the United States was that of the Immaculate Heart Sisters of Los Angeles, whose program of aggiornamento was guided by the prestigious psychologist Carl Rogers, a one-time student for the Protestant ministry who had developed a negative attitude toward religion. The Immaculate Heart Renewal was a paradigm for many others that followed favorable publicity, optimistic expectation, the use of fashionable techniques of behavior modification, and a personified belief. The community soon fell apart. Many sisters left. Those who remained split into opposing factions. There were a few new members, and most apostolates were abandoned. In time, the community virtually ceased to exist. A vacuum. Many religious, having abandoned both traditional spiritualities and traditional ministries, created vacuums waiting to be filled by new absolutes, left-wing politics, environmentalism, waiting to be filled by new absolutes, and above all, feminism. Catholic feminism included lay women, but its most aggressive leadership came from women religious. The new feminist faith required sisters to see themselves as having been exploited laborers in the traditional apostolates and to pursue new careers, often living outside any community structure. At the farthest point, Catholic feminism invoked mythical goddesses and other female spirits of practical neo-pagan rituals. Male communities. The crisis of religious life deeply affected most male communities as well, although they tended to be less openly rebellious than female groups, are less likely to abandon community life and traditional apostolate like education. For example, at the end of council, the Society of Jesus, the largest male community in the church, had 36,000 members throughout the world. But by 2010, the number had fallen well below 20,000. the leadership of the society announced that a fundamental option for the poor was the very reason for its existence, a priority that had been previously recognized and that made difficult to justify much of the society's traditional educational pastoral work. Ecumenism. For 40 years, the Council various economical commissions, Catholic Anglican, Catholic Lutheran, periodically announced agreement among their members, which did not, however, officially bind the participating churches. But despite promising beginnings, economical dialogue with mainline Protestant groups faltered over time because the major thrust of liberal Protestantism was precisely against authoritative creedal statements, so that the search for official agreement on doctrine proved to by decreasing relevance. Even the most daring Catholic theology came to seem timid in the post-conciliar environment when leading Protestant theologians began to speak of religionless Christianity and even of the death of God. In addition, liberal mainline groups eventually ordained women as clergy and tended to accept the sexual revolution, including abortion and homosexuality. The missions. By the time the council, most people understood that Catholicism could no longer be treated solely as a Western religion, but European prelates still made up 13% of the council, almost 3 times the number of other religion groups. Yet missionary activity was then at its highest point in the history of the church. And the third word, bishops were also numerous at the council, although their participation was relatively slight. Cultural relativism. Integral to the revolution of the 60s, however, was cultural relativism. They claimed that every belief was merely an expression of the culture that gave rise to it, and none could lay claim to transcendent truth. Thus, Christianity, which from its foundation was an aggressively missionary religion, was dismissed by many as a merely form of Western cultural imperialism. In this context, the theological emphasis on lived experience, Runners Anonymous Christian Council's favorable view of non-Christian religions combined provoke a severe crisis of missionary identity. There were demands for yet further inculturation, such as accepting polygamy in Africa, but even heavily incultured forms of Christianity were now seen as unwarranted intrusions on cultures that had their own religions. Thus, missionaries, like every other category of priests or religion, began to give up their vocations in large number. Of those who remained, many pulled back from the very idea of making converts, even to the point of defining their tasks in terms of such as helping people to be better Hindus. Some missionaries turned to political actions as their justification, helping to overthrow the vestiges of colonialism and creating a better world in economic and social terms. The kingdom itself, seen as earthly reigns of justice achievable by human effort, from which thought of eternity was a distraction. The church was merely a means by which the kingdom could be achieved, and the anonymous Christian work for social change, passively, without interest in religion at all. Liberation theology. Some Catholics in Latin America was attracted to liberation theology, an entirely new development of Catholic social doctrine that began in Germany. By those principal proponents included the Jesuit Son Sobrino and Juan Luis II in Chile, the Brazilian Franciscan Leonardo de Boff, and the Peruvian secular priest Gustavo Gutierrez. At Medellin, in Colombia in 1968, the Latin American Bishop Conference endorsed the preferential option for the poor and gave cautious encouragement to liberationism, of which some bishops, notably Archbishop Elder Camale of Recife, Brazil, were enthusiastic supporters. Orthopraxis. For liberation theology, a certain concept of social justice was the core meaning of the gospel, requiring from the Christian an unqualified commitment to the transformation of society. Orthopraxis, right action, rather than orthodoxy. While not explicitly denying classical doctrines concerning sin, redemption, and eternal life, liberation theology re-emphasized them almost to the vanishing point, lest they divert people from social struggle. A religion that preached such doctrine was dismissed as bourgeois distortion of the gospel, motivated by the desire to protect social privilege. Marxism. Liberation theologians were Marxists in seeing society as fundamentally a conflict between rich and poor and demanding commitment to the socialist struggle as an act of faith without reserve. Some priests and religious actively participated in would-be revolutionary movement in order to demonstrate solidarity with the oppressed, and leftist Catholic everywhere enthusiastically praised such movement as the only hope of the future. Ostpolitik. In some communist countries, notably Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Catholics were encouraged by their bishop to cooperate with the regimes as much as possible. A policy, Ostpolitik, or Esterparcy, that was also followed by a Vatican that apparently assumed that communism could not be defeated. A group of Jesuits teaching in Rome even identified the Chinese communist dictator Mao Zedong as the hope of the world, the most authentic contemporary representative of the gospel. Base communities. As an alternative to the institutional church, liberation theology extolled base communities that supposedly arose from the people's own awakening sense of injustice, their spontaneous discovery of the principles of liberation. But most such communities seem to have depended on an elite educated leadership who were always few in number and had short lifespans. Protestant gains. Meanwhile, however, many Hispanics, including many who immigrated to the United States, converted to evangelical Protestantism, partly because of what amounted almost to the evacuation of the traditional faith after the council. Told that the ancient pious practices were superstitious and urged to adopt this world theology instead, many concluded that true Christianity had been kept from them by the church. A democratic church. Every disputed issue in the post-conciliar church unavoidably involved the concept of church herself. The term pilgrim church changed from that of a humble and devout traveler following a marked path toward the heavenly kingdom to that of a spiritual explorer following his own life. For some, the concept of the people of God gave rise to the expectation that church would not be governed democratically. Call to action. In connection with the bicentennials of the United States in 1976, Cardinal John F. Dearden of Detroit presided over the call to action conference in his city. Although made up of primarily of clergy, religious, and lay employees of the church, the conference aggressively advocated, among other things, an end to mandatory priestly celibacy, the ordination of women to the priesthood, and the changes in Catholic sexual morality. The failure of the church to embrace that agenda left a legacy of resentment that is still festered decades later. Feminism. Feminists, many of them male, were usually the angriest. After initial hesitation, church authorities admitted women to the ranks of lectors or readers, ministers of communion, and acolytes, or servers at the Mass, which gave rise to the expectation that they would soon be ordained to the priesthood as well. Church authorities pointed out that except among the early Gnostics, there was no precedent for this in the entire history of the church. But the feminist demand for ordination became increasingly strident, denouncing the hierarchy as patriarchal. In few cases, women were ordained as priests or bishops in ceremonies the church did not recognize as valid. There was a partial successful demand for inclusive language in scripture and liturgy, primarily on the grounds that words like man and mankind excluded women and should not be used. Some feminists went as far as to refuse to speak of God as He or as Father. Secularization. The influence of religion in the West, which seems to be substantial for 2 decades after World War II, declined very sharply in the decades after the Council. making the region that had guided the council the most secular in the world. The gravest crisis occurred in precisely those countries that had previously been taught as mostly Catholic. Netherlands. Catholic in Netherlands were very largely minority because of centuries of treatment as second-class citizens and have become highly conscious of their identity to the point of developing their own subculture of labor unions, communication networks, and educational institutions. They were also proportionate to their population the greatest Catholic and missionary country. For a period during and after the council, the Netherlands made a bid to provide the universal church with model of renewal. An official national synod boldly called for a change in almost every area of church life, and priests and people, often cautiously encouraged by their bishops, undertook almost unlimited experimentation. For a brief time, the new Dutch Catechism for adults was extolled as the purest expression of the council, but soon Netherlanders themselves were dismissing it as too conservative. The Catholic subculture quickly collapsed, and the Netherlandism Catholicism became the most liberal in the world, even as Netherlands overall became one of the most secular and morally permissive nations in the world. 40 years after the council, the quality of religious belief and practice was such that one of its bishops declared sadly that the country had become mission territory. Spain. After World War II, Francisco Franco pursued the successful program of economic modernization in Spain, but inevitably the newfound economic prosperity led to social and cultural unrest. Although Franco sometimes clashed with the Catholic hierarchy of his refusal to extend political freedoms, his authoritarian regime was closely identified with the church and with traditional morality, so that after his death in 1975, there was a popular reaction against religion and toward an easy hedonism. Ireland. Until the 1990s, Ireland was still regarded as very Catholic society, but there also a sudden prosperity led to the hedonistic reaction against the church, fueled by revelation of clerical pedophilia that the bishop had ignored. Ireland, however, remained one of the very few Western nations that did not permit abortion. Italy. In Italy, a substantial majority of citizens, in defiance of their hierarchy, voted to legalize divorce. And in time, the Italian birth rate dropped, becoming the lowest in the Europe. Malta. The tiny island Republic of Malta could be considered the most Catholic European country, officially proclaimed such in its constitution and forbidding divorce and abortion. However, even there, weekly mass attendance fell from 82% in 1967 to barely half in 2010. Poland. In Poland, freedom from communism proved to be a mixed blessing. As a hedonistic consumer society, spread from the West, and by 2010, the rate of mass attendance had fallen to 60%. Integralism. In the experience of liberal Protestantism, exposed the essential fallacy of an uncritical accommodation with secularity. The experience of the Netherlands, Spain, Ireland, and Quebec, and some other places also exposed the essential fallacy of integralism. The demand that political, social, and economic life be intimately bound up with religion, an ideal of medieval Christendom that was shattered by the Reformation and the French Revolution. The essential fallacy of integralism was that in such closed system, change of any kind, even beneficial change, necessarily cause instability and thereby undermine religion. The conditions of modern life are such that no society can remain permanently protected from the forces of the modern world, and the people who have been inoculated against these forces can often withstand them better than those who have been protected in terms of dignitatis humanae. The authentic Christian life must live in freedom. A troubled Pope, Cardinal Montini, participated in the first session of the council, and although he said relatively little from the floor, was considered preeminent a man of the council. His election as a pope was completely expected. Many had thought him worthy of office already in 1958, and he was given the responsibility bringing the council to a conclusion, overseeing its implementation. Career. Prior to his 9-year episcopacy, the future Paul VI had spent his entire career in the service of the Holy See, and although not even bishop, was recognized as one of the most important men in Vatican under Pius XII. He also did pastoral work, especially as chaplain to university students in Milan. He was strongly anti-fascist, and his students were sometimes physically assaulted by black shirt gangs. But by neglecting to make him a cardinal, Pius effectively excluded Montini from achieving the papal office in 1958, a neglect that John 23 immediately remedied. This is the reason for Pius sending Montini away from Rome, then failing to make him a cardinal. And certainly in some sense, Pius probably considered him too liberal. Ressourcement. It was Paul VI's cross to preside over the church during this great crisis. A disciple of Maritain, he saw that growing split between aggiornamento and ressourcement, and although he was inclined by the nature to be open to new ideas, his sympathies ultimately lay with the ressourcement school, who were now deemed conservative. He conferred that cardinalate on the Dulubac, Danilo, and Congar, and offered it to Maritain, who declined. Social teaching. Paul continued the modern papal tradition of addressing the social issues in an authoritative way, directed to the entire world. Populorum progressio, the progress of people, seemed to accept the modern economic theory that poverty is best overcome not by redistributing wealth, but by the economic development of the entire society, which improved the lot of everyone. But the Pope identified the poverty of the Third World as to a great extent the fault of the developed nations, and called for an equitable sharing of resources, including technology, to facilitate development not as a charity, but as an obligation of justice. Firm action. Prior to human naivete, Paul showed himself as capable of action. He intervened to ensure that Lumen Gentium would adequately respect papal infallibility, declared on his own authority that Mary is the mother of the church, instructed the council fathers not to discuss clerical celibacy, vetoed an attempt by the Jesuits to weaken their vow of special obedience to the Pope, and suddenly replaced Bugnini as the overseer of liturgical change. Indecision. Paul sometimes argues publicly over the many crises of the church, even lamenting that the smoke of Satan has entered the church, but he often seemed indecisive. Although he made a special effort to encourage the use of Latin in liturgy, he did nothing to alter the direction of liturgical change and took no decisive action against the rising tide of open militant theological dissent. Having touched off a firestorm with human naivete, the Pope seemed reluctant to mandate its acceptance. Several national bishop conferences appeared to disassociate themselves from the encyclical, and when Cardinal Patrick O'Boyle of Washington suspended the number of priests who had rejected it, he was required by the Holy See to reinstate them. The exodus of men from priesthood became a flood, in part because under Paul it was the policy of Holy See to release priests from their obligation almost for the asking. The laxity seems to correspond with number of annulments granted to married couple, which, as already noted, also increased geometrically. Ultimately, it was left to Paul's successors to begin process of authentic renewal. Although in the sense the council had received to modify papal authority, procollegiality, a strong papacy proved to be the only means of maintaining the unity of the church in face of centrifugal forces unleashed by the council. Master Resty, medyo mahaba pa to. Ano po ang decision natin dito? Master? Master Resty.
Yeah, ilang slide pa?
Mahaba pa po to. Siguro, mga 50 pa po to.
Okay. So kung
Dito,
gusto lang
overtime.
Kayo,
mag-overtime tayo.
lahat ba pumapayag?
Sabi ko nga po, kahit hanggang alas 12 ng gabi. Ay, ng umaga. Umaga pala, umaga.
Okay.
Sa'yo, brother, marami, sa'yo, brother, medyo ikay teenager ka marami tayong mga senior citizen.
Yung mga kwan, okay ba sa
Hindi
inyo?
hindi na po ako teenager. Malapit na ako maging 51. 51 na ako sa January.
Ganun ba? Kayo po,
Okay.
yung sa akin po, wala akong problema na ituloy ko to, pero also kung sa mga kapatid natin, which are senior citizens, which also needs to have the rest.
Okay.
Sa decision po niyo, Master.
Okay. Ang converges ba ng iba? Okay bang ituloy o hindi? Pwede tayo
Sa akin po, okay lang po. Ewan ko sa iba. Kasi nakikita ko dito, halos lahat ng bansa may mga church history ng Catholic eh.
Maganda yung
Opo.
kaya hindi ko po maputol o kaya ma-edit katulad ng kwan kasi maganda po yung history kung nakita natin yung movement ng church eh.
Kahit sa bansa ka pumunta, meron talaga mga nakatala, mga recorded na mga
talaga.
Catholic church talaga.
Very interesting tong na to, itong subject matter. Kaya nasa inyo po ang decision, Master.
Wala akong problema, pwedeng ituloy.
Siguro matibay.
Meron kasing 29. Kung gusto niyo pong ituloy.
Hindi po.
Okay lang.
Hindi po pwede na i-continue na lang sa next meeting.
Gusto niya magkwan. Sino po yung gusto magkwan ng continuation next week? Kasi
nag-record ba?
magkukuhan tayo ng isang canonical reading, mag-move tayo ng isang day. Okay? Walang problema sa akin kung sigo.
Sa akin po, paano po yung decision na ninyo, Master? Kayo po.
Okay,
Pasensya po kasi mag-record pa ako pagkatapos. Mag-record po kasi ako pagkatapos. Tapos yung anak ko, gabi lang available. So, pasensya na po. Bukas kasi yung report ko.
Okay, sige. Okay. So, i-reset natin ng isang linggo next kasama yung examination.
Okay, patay tayo dyan. So, kailangan natin re-reset, Master, to?
Reset lang natin ng Miyerkules uli.
Martes pala. October.
And then, i-move natin yung isang canonical reading na Martes papunta sa huli. Sa huling Martes uli. Sa susunod na Martes, ha?
October 12 to, Master?
Okay po, sige po. Wala problema.
Seresti.
Apa.
Kailan po yung exam kasi pumunta ko ng Palawan, napupunta na ako ni Father. Hindi ako makaka-exam sa'yo.
Hindi, online.
Opo, wala naman pong wifi doon. Kinakailangan ko pang pumunta sa Manisa, sa sentro ng kasi po yun bundok sa papuntang El Nido.
Bale, kung kailan ko basta ilalagay ko doon sa classroom, ha?
Sige po, sige. Sige po. So
sige,
bukas, hindi na po ito tuloy.
Hindi na natin muna ituloy. Ikuha natin sa next week. Pagkatapos
Salamat po. Ang ganda, ang ganda.
Ang ganda na itong topic. Grabe to. Kasi andito yung modern history ng church, yung tribulation
Okay.
Tsaka yung kahit saan bansa mo tingnan, talagang Catholic Church talaga. May mga recorded na kung ano yung nangyari during that time, no? Doon mo makikita yung pagiging true church ng Catholic Church kahit marami nagkiklaim Wala silang patunay ng history.
Alright.
Right.
Okay,
sige,
so
Master,
closing prayer muna tayo. Closing prayer, ha? Dali.